SantaCruzSentinel.com.
Hello and welcome to the Reporter's Notebook, presented by the Santa Cruz Sentinel. I am your host, Anthony L. Solis. Today we're going to talk about the school walkout last week, protesting the shooting in Florida and gun laws. And with me is the Sentinel reporter who covered that, Nick Ibarra. Nick, thanks for joining me.
Hi, Tony. Happy to be here.
Are you really?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a fascinating topic and one that I've been geeking out a lot on. And I think there's so many different angles. You know, when you talk about gun violence and student protests, it's almost, difficult to know where to begin.
Yeah, we had a conversation last week. It was on Wednesday after you got back from covering them. And our, we were talking about covering the protests and kind of covering the school shootings in general, and, led into what our responsibility is as a newspaper, as a media outlet, as journalists. And I thought it was a fascinating topic. And I even pointed to you and say, hey, we're going to talk in the podcast about this. Would you be down? And you said, sure. Let's do it. So why don't you tell me, first, where did you go and who did you talk to, as far as the protests go?
So we went, myself and, a photographer and our new video intern. We all went to Watsonville High School, where really more than 1,000 students actually ended up walking out of classes, which, as we understand it, was the largest protest in the county. It was incredibly impressive. I'd spoken with the organizers the day before, a group of mostly juniors and a couple of seniors. They said they were expecting at least 100 people. They had done some signups online. They'd been organizing. And, they really didn't actually know what to expect. There was a moment, in fact, right at about 9:59 on Wednesday morning, where the organizers are out there. They've already left their classes. It's a group of maybe 10, a dozen students, and they end up running through the Watsonville High School campus shouting, "Walkout." Walkout. And it's this beautiful moment because I don't know what's going to happen. They don't have a clear sense of what's going to happen. And what did end up happening is students literally started streaming out of their classrooms. Just more than 1,000 students. I think it's impossible to say that it was the entire student body at Watsonville High School, but we're talking about a vast majority of that high school's student body, which is somewhere around 2,000 students. So they stream out, and they end up going out to the front of the high school, which is East Beach Street in Watsonville, and lining that entire block. It's a long block. They're lining it from one end down to the other, rows of students deep, end to end on the block, hundreds of signs. It was quite an impressive display.
And chanting, if I remember. I think you heard a little bit of chanting at the beginning of this podcast, which is from your, you were interviewing some people and you got some of the chants on there. So we started the podcast off with some of those chants. And why did you pick Watsonville? Did you have any sense that might be the biggest one in the county? Yeah,
it really came from knowing that, from having communicated with one of the organizers, who was a junior, a 17-year-old student there named Sophia. And we knew from speaking with her that they'd made a really strong organizational push. She's a really committed activist student, and she seemed really put together. She, again, had signed up more than 100 students, so we knew that something was going to happen there. And this group of activist students were extremely organized. They'd sent out a press release. They seemed really on top of things. And we just had a sense that this was probably going to be one of, if not the biggest turnout in the county, which turned out to be true. So at other high schools, it's difficult to get an exact tally, but our reporting indicates roughly 14 other high schools and a number of middle schools also had students participate in the walkout. So that's more or less every high school in the county. And in some cases, you had hundreds of students. But really, as far as we could tell, Watsonville High School turned out their entire student body, more or less.
Now, could you, you said mostly the entire student body walked out, but did you talk to anybody, or did you even see anybody that was maybe not for the protest, or anybody that stayed behind, or was it kind of hard to tell with all the students streaming out?
Yeah, that's interesting. I didn't specifically see anyone who stayed in a classroom. There were different degrees of participation, which was very clear. So you have the students with signs, who are standing on the edge of the curb, who are participating in chants and leading chants. And then you sort of had a gradation of hundreds of students who were milling behind them, participating to a lesser degree, or really just observing. So I think it seemed to me that essentially every student was out in front of the high school participating to varying degrees. But I think the opinions, there was certainly a spectrum of participation and even, opinions on what they were calling for and what they wanted to see happen.
Did you talk to anybody that might have been personally affected by gun violence? Because we have had instances here in the county, Santa Cruz and Watsonville, of drive-by shootings and gang violence, things like that. So I think that in some of our schools there might be more desire to see gun laws changed. I mean, did you get a sense of that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I really didn't that particular day. I do know, this is the students, some of the students that I spoke with talked about gun violence affecting our community in general terms. I didn't personally speak with anyone who mentioned that it had directly affected them in that sense, but it was certainly something that was on everyone's mind. I know that was the case, particularly at Watsonville High School and also at Santa Cruz High School, that the local effects of gun violence, even beyond school shootings, is certainly something that these young people seem to be really concerned about and seem to be aware of.
Did any of them convey to you as a member of the media, maybe you in the media aren't doing enough, or, people can lump all of us media people together like we have a club, monthly meetings or something, but that we're not doing enough, or that maybe we're doing too much glorifying the shooters and anything like that?
It's interesting because that is something that I know that you and I have spoken about, and it's a topic that I think is actually probably underreported. The students that I spoke with were, I think my impression was, happy with the media presence, and they were not focused on casting blame on the media, and that was not a thread that I did hear. I think that's in fact probably a thread that should be or could be discussed more, when you talk about the effects that media coverage potentially has on the contagion, on spreading social contagions. And it's something that's really well understood when it comes to things like suicides, right? So we here at the Sentinel and at most newspapers have policies where we don't report on suicides out of a sense for multiple reasons, but one of them being that there is a sense that could actually contribute to more people being inspired in some sense
the copycat,
to copy that act.
Right. But we do also have there becomes a problem when a suicide is in a public place and it becomes a news, then we have to make that decision. And usually we do report that maybe there was a suicide, but it's really on a case-by-case basis on whether or not we report on it, because it's news when it becomes public and, out in the open. Right.
Absolutely. And I think the same conversation has begun to happen in recent years around mass shootings. And in fact, there's a growing body of research that indicates that mass shootings may spread in a similar copycat way, as I believe the term in psychology is a social contagion. And there was one really interesting paper that came out in 2016 out of Western New Mexico University. And those researchers, as reported by the American Psychological Association, really strongly stated that they believed that media coverage, and particularly glorification, talking about portraying mass shootings as the deadliest in history, as this body count
using
concept,
those
using
big,
those superlatives,
words,
right?
Yeah.
Superlatives, and portraying these images that I think we've probably all seen of mass shooters posing with guns. There's this menacing anti-hero sense that I think we've all seen, and that those factors and really just hammering in their names through reporting, so that it frequently is the case that I think I could think of the names of 10 or more mass shooters, and they've really infiltrated these unstable individuals have really infiltrated our cultural consciousness in this way that psychologists are increasingly saying actually leads to potentially more of these incidents. And in fact, this researcher, Jennifer B. Johnston, she put the case so strongly that she said that it's possible that if media changed the way it covers mass shootings, you could see a reduction by as much as a third in the frequency of mass attacks, which is really an incredible statement if true. And I think certainly there's more research to be done. But the way that at least this psychologist is putting it, that could be a really substantial thing to look into.
Do you think that the media has at least begun to change? I mean, I can think of, the Columbine shootings, and I can think of the names of those two shooters right off the bat. And that was kind of the first big, school shooting that everyone sort of remembers when it happened, and that you couldn't believe that it was happening. And
Absolutely.
Now there seems to be, unfortunately, a lot more. But I also, I had to look up the name of the Parkland shooter because I couldn't remember it. And I am reading as much, if not more, about shootings now than I did back then. I kind of remembered the name of the Colorado theater guy during the Batman movie.
Right.
And I don't want to name any names here to glorify them. Obviously, I'm just kind of vaguely referring to them. In the Sandy Hook, I didn't know his name at all. So that actually kind of, after we talked, led me to believe that maybe there is sort of a conscious decision on the way or the number of times that a name is mentioned in a story.
I think there really is. And in fact, their Pointer and other professional journalism societies and organizations have put out guidelines. And I think that those guidelines are certainly seem to be followed. I think there has been an improvement that you could see there in press coverage. And just to go over, the basic things that those guidelines really tell you to do is minimize uses of the perpetrator's name, as you just mentioned, and the fact that some of those names aren't immediately popping into your head is perhaps an indication that that's happening. I've kind of seen it go both ways, and really to minimize use of photos, names, body counts, as I mentioned earlier, and just to focus on not sensationalizing the story. And I think that different outlets and even different individual reporters have had varying degrees of success being aware of and implementing those guidelines. Unfortunately, the other side of the coin is these stories are incredibly powerful, and they're stories that there's an incredible amount of public interest in. So you're kind of it's a push-pull there,
right,
where the public wants to know in the 24 hours after an attack. They want to know who did this. They want to know why. And in some sense,
that can help prevent future. I mean, if there's an understanding of why this happened, it's sort of the old, you have to admit there's a problem before you can fix a problem.
Yeah.
If you understand why this happened, then maybe you can prevent future instances of this happening. And,
Absolutely.
So you have to learn about the monster before you can help, quell future monsters. And you mentioned, some of the societies, the journalism societies that have codes of ethics, and I have the Society for Professional Journalists Code of Ethics listed right here. There's 4 of them with a couple of subcategories, but the main categories are seek truth and report it, which is fairly obvious.
Sure.
Minimize harm. Now that goes into what we are talking about. If reporting on the shooter can increase harm by promoting copycat, then that's the line that you have to walk, or the decisions that you have to make as reporters and editors. Also, we have act independently and be accountable and transparent. And I think, that's those 4. That's what you need right there for journalism. Do you think about these often when you are writing some of your stories? I mean, are they all kind of like sitting in the back of your head?
Yeah, they really are. I mean, I'm something of an idealist when it comes to the ethics of reporting myself, as I think are many journalists. And of course, those ethical guidelines are things that I think we have to reiterate and return to, because the process of reporting does pull you in so many different directions. There can be a rush to want to be first.
Yes.
Which in some sense can make the kind of thoughtfulness that maybe you would otherwise have in determining whether you're following these ethical guidelines, that can push that to the side or risk pushing it to the side. And there really is just an idea of, news can be salacious, right? And even when it comes to violent news, like there's a reason that that traffic happens on the other side of a freeway from an accident, right? And I think news sort of plays into that same part of human nature, and it's a little bit playing with fire. And I think it's something that we really need to think about as individual journalists in terms of those ethical considerations. Are the words that we use, and certainly I think even with television, this is even more the case, the images and video that we show, what's really the purpose of doing that?
Right. Are you trying to get ratings? Or are you trying to inform the public?
Right. And it's not a simple answer, right? We are businesses, so certainly
bills
that is a consideration.
Paid.
Bills have to be paid. But it's one that certainly is thought about, I think, in journalism schools and by the Society for Professional Journalists and other societies. But I do worry that it's a conversation, particularly when it comes to mass shootings, that doesn't happen enough in the newsrooms themselves. And that's something that I think about. Actually, what really made me aware of this was reading a piece in the New Yorker from a couple of years ago by Malcolm Gladwell called Thresholds of Violence, I believe. And it's just this really thoughtful, long-form piece that looks at different case studies of some of these high school students in particular who were planning on carrying out mass attacks and who were thwarted. And then you have these FBI interviews, these police interviews, and they really, as Malcolm Gladwell reported, sat down with these individuals and talked to them about their motivation. And reading some of those transcripts and reading some of those quotes really made me think about the potential for harm and the potential for the social contagion to spread in a different way. So I think, taking that step, that's just one piece, but really taking the responsibility to inform yourself about what science says, and maybe that will change and continue to evolve. But that's an important step that I think all journalists can and should take.
It's come up. I was just thinking about our topic today because we're recording this on Wednesday, and the FedEx bombing, the suspect killed himself in a bomb this morning. And I haven't looked at his name yet. I know he has been identified as at the moment that we're recording this Wednesday afternoon, but I know his name's going to go out there. And I thought how unfortunate that we are going to have this podcast, this topic on the day. I mean, fortunate that we're talking about it and it needs to be talked about, but how unfortunate that it happened again, and that I have to think about this again. Nobody ever wants to really do that. And I wanted to go back to something that you said about, we are a business. We do need to make money, but the images, the words that we use, are very important. There's an old newspaper adage, and it might be it's past time for this to change. I guess I should say that if it bleeds, it leads.
Exactly.
That's what we used to go by. Even when I started in journalism 25 years ago, which, in the long run isn't that long ago, that's what we went by. If it bleeds, it leads. And then we started, I think we really started becoming aware of the images we were putting out. We had an image of a baby a bloodied baby being taken out of a car wreck that we had. And the baby survived. It was a very powerful, powerful image taken by a photo intern who was the son of our photographer, Bill Lovejoy. So this was Nick Lovejoy who took this photo, but we didn't run it main. We did run it. We made sure it was the secondary photo, the smaller photo, because we just had this problem of you can't tell if the baby's alive, if the baby's dead. And, we, those of us in the newsroom gathered around and really kind of argued both sides of this for a while before we came to a consensus. And it might have been the editor at the time who said, no, we're running it, but we're running it small. We're not making it the lead photo.
Yeah.
But go back a couple years before that, the Loma Prieta earthquake. Now, you might not remember this, or you might not even know this story, but there's the photo that we ran, full page, all the way across the width of the page, of volunteers taking a woman out of the rubble, and her leg is pretty badly mangled. And if I remember correctly, on that day, we ran the full image where you can see the mangled leg. And it's a brutal image to look at, but it told the story of that particular day of the volunteers rescuing people from the rubble of, bricks falling on them. But since then, we have always cropped it so you can't see. And it was just one of those decisions of, you have to weigh the pros and cons. Now, that's not an instance of you might get a copycat. That's an instance of, the if it bleeds, it leads scenario. But it's still some of the things that, we need to discuss and we need to be aware of as journalists, of the importance of the images and the words that we use.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a great example. And in fact, there's been a limited number of times as a fairly young journalist that type of decision has been one that I've been in a position to need to make. But it did happen when I was copy editing for another newspaper, in fact. And this was after a shooting at the Oregon Junior College. And off the top of my head, I can't recall if that was in 2013, 2014. But a few years back, I think most people will remember. And the newspaper wanted to put, that was planning on putting the picture of him with a gun that was pulled from, I believe, his MySpace profile, believe it or not. And he was holding a gun and looking menacing. And the placement that came in front of me was, okay, we're going to put this photo above the fold on the front page. And that was really the first time that kind of, a red flag went up in my mind, with the idea that putting a photo above the fold is an additional,
which means layer. You can see it in a newsstand.
Right. So for the non-journalists, I apologize. So that means, this is what you see in the newsstand, right? So that you are going to, you're going to essentially put this photo in front of people walking through a downtown area, any area with a newsstand, whether they want it or not. So removing the choice. And I think that viewer choice is important too, that there is an additional degree of content maybe that's appropriate to show people who seek it out consensually, and we've seen this with profanity, right? In podcasts with profanity, there's an unedited version on the website, or it can kind of go both ways. And I think that was a great example for me where it really occurred to me, this is a choice, this is a decision point. And I raised a red flag about it and said, hey, I think, this may not be the most ethically appropriate placement for the photo. They ended up deciding to run it anyway, which is, of course, shut
up, intern, and run it. Do what I say. Yeah.
Which is, of course, any newspaper's choice to do. But that was, a moment for me where it came home that this is not theoretical, that these are real decisions that have to be made increasingly every day or every month. So it's definitely something that I think about more and more.
Well, I think the Sentinel continues to think about this. Unfortunately, as often as these decisions have to come up, but it's something that not just us, but all journalists everywhere do struggle with, especially, as I look at these code of ethics, seek truth and report it, and then minimize harm. What we have to do is figure out what to do when those two ethical points go against each other. And that's what this is run up to. But Nick, thanks for taking the time to talk to me about the podcast. I really like this conversation that we were having last week, and so I really wanted to continue it here. And I also, I don't want to tease too much, but you're kind of showing an interest in maybe having a podcast here, and so
absolutely, you heard it here first. Podcasting is something I've been looking for.
You mentioned it to me a while ago, yeah.
So hopefully more to come. And thanks for having me. It has been an absolute pleasure.
Okay, thank you, Nick. If you'd like to subscribe to the Reporter's Notebook, you may search for the Reporter's Notebook on iTunes and Google Play.